Nothing's wrong with playing a game on easy mode, but some people are just looking for much more of a challenge. And the reason for that is often the game feels like a different experience, like it has more depth, like there's more to reach for, like achieving your goals is not just foregone. If easy mode gives you a sense of fate that you will eventually complete the tasks of the game, harder difficulty levels smash that view of the world. But why? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRinks we ask the question, how do games change completely when playing on the highest difficulty? There are people who will not play a game on easy or normal, they just won't. When they buy a new game, they have to jump off in the deep end from the diving board, and not the small diving board that the kids use, but the big diving board that the pros use. And I get that. They've played games their entire life and understand exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Easy mode offers a degree of, let's say, forgiveness when one makes a mistake that harder modes do not. And if you make a reflexive mistake in a harder mode, you're often punished for it. Let's talk exactly about why, by talking about what a hard mode actually is. Ideally speaking, and in a lot of games, it means the artificial intelligence is a little bit more aware. It's perhaps a more complicated routine. It asks more questions before it makes actions. Well, ideally speaking. In a lot of cases, hard mode is actually just giving the artificial intelligence too much awareness. Or, for instance, making all of the enemies into bullet sponges. I can shoot you 30 times and you don't die, why? There's no rational equivalent to that in real life, and though I get it. Games are not meant to be 100% realistic. I mean, the world would be a pretty frightening place if that were the case, so I'm glad it's not. I mean, I don't really need an interplanetary threat that the Space Marines are defending for us. That's fine. But there is a line, I think, that kind of makes things a little bit, well, weird when you play in hard mode. One might call it unbalanced in favor of the game mode. All of the balancing systems that are in place to make a game, well, seem believable on some level, are sort of ignored in order to give the game an unfair advantage. Whereas easy mode is actually a similar thing. One could call it unbalanced in favor of the player mode. Now, as I said, obviously not every single hard and easy mode are like that, but this is something that does fundamentally change a game, in quantifiable means like how many bullets it takes to defeat an enemy, and in also more abstract means in that it may activate an entirely different AI routine. Being that hard mode doesn't necessarily mean better AI or more intelligent AI, it may just mean that the game is going to play unfair. It can do one of two things. If it actually is playing fair and just has created more intelligent AI routines to play in hard mode, it can end up showing the holes in the control scheme. For instance, let's say the response time of a certain command isn't so good. When enemies aren't designed to immediately kill you every time you make a mistake, i.e. easy mode, it would make that control scheme flaw less noticeable. But if the opposite is true, and enemies are designed to seize on literally anything and just attack the living crap out of you no matter what happens, then let's say the block command has a little bit of a delay on it. Well, that little delay is a lot more noticeable, because it's going to impact your experience repeatedly. I'm going to give you an example of some games that did it right. The first few Halo games did a fantastic job of scaling the AI as opposed to simply unbalancing the game. Recent ones, I would say, have maybe not stayed on that path. I would say 5 being the most egregious of this, just loaded with bullet sponges at higher difficulty levels. But if you're a fan of a fair high difficulty level that just makes the game legitimately more difficult for the reasons it's difficult at lower difficulty levels, at least for new players, can make a game seem better. But it's not always for better or for worse that it changes a game. A lot of the time, simply having a different style of controls doesn't work. For instance, the more realistic the controls are, speaking in terms of momentum or more realistic behaviors, for instance, not just being able to begin another move immediately. If it's more realistic movement, it's going to be significantly harder no matter how you're ratcheting up the difficulty level. For instance, if you've ever played The Witcher 3, you know that Geralt's movement is, I would say, not arcadey at all. He has momentum. When he changes direction, he changes it like a person as opposed to like an avatar. And depending on personal taste, that's either very good or very bad. In fact, Geralt's movements are so good, and the way that game is set up works so well, that playing it at a normal difficulty level, I prefer it to most arcade games, which I would normally like more than this type of a game. I don't know how often I say it, but some of my favorite games out there are the two Bayonetta games. And to say that the character movement in that game is realistic would be basically the equivalent of saying we haven't been to the moon. No, that's not correct. Those two games are beat-em-ups at the core, and for an old arcade gamer like myself, yes, I'm perfectly comfortable saying that about myself, someone who played Street Fighter 2, Final Fight, all these buttons where you could mash and mash and mash, and that's how you learned it. You didn't necessarily get away with mashing it, you just had no other way of learning it. Bayonetta works on an intrinsic level for me. And when I play it in harder difficulty levels, it's almost the same experience for me. It's a bit harder, I die a little bit more, but all the same timing is necessary, blocking is a little less necessary, just being a little bit more careful is necessary, but the experience is generally the same. I can't say that when I play Witcher 3. The game is much harder, you die very fast. Because Witcher's gameplay is a lot more complicated, requires a lot more tactical decisions, requires shifting gears a lot more often, and on top of that, Geralt behaves a little bit more like a real person. You can't just have him flying all over the screen. It doesn't work that way, he can't do it. He can do a lot of stuff that a real person can't do, but the laws of physics regarding his movements, well, they pretty much stay the same. Well, the game asks you to think faster. That doesn't mean press different buttons faster, that means, strategically speaking, somebody has to be able to change while accommodating these physical limitations. And when the enemies become significantly harder, it's a lot harder to do that stuff. Pacing can change in a harder difficulty level. Artificial intelligence can be more complex. Enemies can be armed with more capable weaponry and/or magic. The dynamics of the game can change. In certain games they don't so much, but in certain games they do. For me, Witcher 3 at the hardest difficulty level isn't really that fun. And I know somebody's gonna be like, "Oh, Falcon, how dare you? It's so much more fun at that difficulty level." Here's where taste comes in. Not everybody's gonna agree on what's good and what's not good. For me, impossible difficulty isn't really the most enjoyable thing in the world. And yet I do actually rather like, say, the Dark Souls games, or Bloodborne for that matter. They are very hard games, but as I was talking about earlier, the control scheme sort of makes it so that there's a little bit less to do to adapt to the harder situations, other than realize that dying isn't the worst thing. Ultimately, what separates various different games is the dynamics. The experience can feel incredibly different based on dynamics. Imagine if Bayonetta had controls that were more like The Witcher. Imagine Bayonetta had to deal with more momentum and couldn't turn on a dime and perform insane acrobatic feats that truly have no regard for the laws of physics in any way. Imagine that wasn't possible. Bayonetta would be a completely different game. So if difficulty fairly changes, for instance, enemies aren't just given near infinite health, but rather their AI changes or their awareness changes in different ways, it can change the dynamics of the game. Long story short, hard mode doesn't necessarily just mean everything but more. It may mean a few other things, and those are variables that may change the core experience of the game, especially on a game that doesn't rely on the fast execution of things, but rather more strategic execution of things. Requiring people to make strategic decisions quicker often results in different decisions. And because so many developers and publishers believe that changing simply the balance of the game means changing the difficulty level, a lot of the time the reason that a difficulty level changes the experience is just that the game has become unfair. And that's why I stick around the normal difficulty level more often than not nowadays. The developers try to balance as best they can in normal, the quality assurance testers tend to test in normal, and also I don't want to be shunned from society from being abnormal. That's a joke. What's an example of a game that feels like a different game when you play it in hard mode? Like I said before, I think Witcher 3 is a good example. You can back me up on that one, or if you thought of another game, I'd love to hear about it. Let's meet in the comment section and have that discussion. If you enjoyed this video, please click like, and if you're not subscribed, now is a great time to hit that subscription button because we upload brand new videos daily. We thank you very much for watching this video. My name is Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on GameRanks.